I've been kind of accumulating thoughts about close-up as a photographic technique and as a filmic technique. And it seemed to me, in conversation with Simon Baker, who's my co-curator here, that it was potentially a kind of thread that could link really very, very widely diverse historical periods, I mean, from the early 19th century up to the present day. I mean, to look at, and I said it's contemporary practice, to look at the historic avant-garde, and to look at actually the origins of photography. And I think one of the other very interesting things that this exhibition brings out, with its focus on this sort of notion of close-up, is the interconnectedness of what are often seen as very opposite tendencies in the early 20th century. Surrealism on the one side, new objectivity and abstraction on the other. In fact, the two are quite interestingly and closely linked.
The beginning of the show was to look at scientific material from the 19th century and to think about the first ways in which lenses had been used to explore the very microscopic, very small-scale world around us, or around scientists at the time, and in those circumstances to really reveal things about the world that hadn't previously been understood. Allied to that, if you like, in the beginning part of the 20th century, there's definitely a shift within the use of the close-up in the history of photography that's mirrored within the show, which is to move from straightforward scientific experiments to an interest in the kind of formal, visual side effects or results of those kinds of scientific approaches. So there is a movement, if you like, from what we might understand as science to what we would hopefully all readily recognise as art.
We've included quite a few publications in this exhibition from the late 20s and from the 1930s, from this moment really when close-up became such an important part of the avant-gardes. And I think that journals, books, magazines were all very important modes of dissemination for photography and for close-up. Particularly striking are some of the photographs that were included in the magazine Document that was overseen by Georges-Bataille. The photographs of the close-up photographs of big toes by Boiffard have really become some of the sort of seminal images of the 20th century and have certainly had their impact on more contemporary artists and writers. And I think that lingering on sort of the details of the body and lingering on skin, hair, ill-cut nails undoubtedly has resonances with some of the very contemporary videos of the body and of skin surfaces that we have upstairs. Perhaps a rather different kind of close-up photograph were a series of collaborations between Salvador Dalí and Brassaï. Dalí was fascinated by close-up, by photography, and especially by little things. He once wrote a poem called Little Things, Little Things, Little Things, which simply said little things, little things, little things. And these close-up photographs are of little sort of scraps of matter which have been in some way wielded or manoeuvred or modelled by the human hand. The photographs are by Brassaï, and they were reproduced in the Surrealist journal Minotaur, 1933, with the title Involuntary Sculptures, forms that were created unconsciously by gestures that were not sort of deliberately geared towards the outcome of a sculpture. Dalí also collaborated with the filmmaker Louis Buñuel on the very famous film Un Chien Andalou, an Andalusian dog, which they made in over a period, little over a week, in 1929. And that includes close-up, a number of different kinds of close-up. And one sees there how what was quite, I suppose, quite an accepted form of sort of a film manipulation in silent film, it turned to much more disturbing effect.
Although close-up primarily deals with works made with lenses, and we've drawn attention to the idea of zooming in and microscopy and things where we would normally expect proximity to be produced through magnification. There are also a series of works within the show that have no relationship to lenses at all. This is so-called cameraless photography, that are either called photograms or in some cases rayograms after Man Ray, who attached his own name to the cameraless photographs that he made. He would place objects directly on the paper and then expose that light-sensitive paper to light. Anything that was on the paper would then be left, and the area around those objects would be exposed, and so you would have a kind of negative of the objects that you had left on the paper. Now what this means is that depending on the porosity or the ability of light to penetrate those objects, you actually have direct impressions of different kinds of objects on photographic paper. We've tried to signal not only that this was a popular game with the surrealists, and not only Man Ray but other photographers like Jacques-Andre Boiffard made these photograms. Not only that it was of interest to the surrealists, maybe because it has that element of kind of play or chance within the process, but we're also suggesting within the show that there's a legacy of that kind of practice, and there's a really astounding work, a film work by Brakhage, where he's actually produced a film by putting tiny pieces of the subject of the film, in this case moths, and tiny pieces of moth wing and so on, projected, flipped onto the wall, and it becomes, they're transformed, if you like, from pieces of the world into very, very abstract shapes and combinations.
One of the gems in this exhibition is a little photograph, probably a contact print by Man Ray, which was taken in 1920. It was reproduced in a Dada magazine called Littérature, and the caption simply said, "This is the domain of Eros c'est la vie," how dry it is, how fertile it is, how joyous it is, how sad it is. View taken from an aeroplane by Man Ray. There was nothing to indicate what the actual scale of this photograph was, so it was presenting itself as an aerial photograph. In fact, of course, it is a photograph of a corner of Marcel Duchamp's The Large Glass, and this had been lying gathering dust in Duchamp's studio before Duchamp decided that he wanted Man Ray to photograph it. I think one of Duchamp's ideas in leaving it gathering dust was not just that he'd really got bored with it or was too lazy to carry on with it. He was actually interested in the accumulation of kind of debris, of dust over time. It's very interesting. There's a direct echo in another work we have in the exhibition by Kelley. And these are similarly photographs of small, little ephemeral, really overlooked things, which photographed with very beautiful kind of silvery grey light could be on almost any scale. I mean, they are close-ups, they're big photographs. And what is shown, of course, is actually tiny. But I think the relationship between recognition and scale is one that close-up constantly puts into question.
And one of the things that I hope the exhibition will show is that artists have been developing and expanding the idea of the close-up over time. It's not necessarily the case that there's been a kind of development, as the close-up hasn't necessarily got better, but it's certainly got more diverse, and that the concept has been exploited in very, very different ways. And we find, for example, very strong connections between the things that artists were doing at the beginning of the 20th century and things that they were doing after the Second World War, and indeed still today. There are some really striking examples of works that involve close-ups on the face or on the body, where artists have tried to, if you like, use the close-up to make that thing with which we're most familiar, in other words, our own bodies, something very, very strange and alarming. And there are these connections and links are very visible in works from the early 20th century by photographers like Aenne Biermann, a German photographer, who makes a kind of cropped close-up of a nose and a mouth. It looks very, very strange, blown up and presented out of context. Or a work by a photographer like Jacques-Andre Boiffard, who photographed a very long fringe, or eyes kind of peering out from behind thick hair, which it's very unclear what you're looking at. Those early photographers were really interested in a kind of frightening defamiliarizing of the world through either through kind of cropping or through being the close-up, an extreme close-up. And that's developed in later works through much more kind of programmatic processes. And there are, for example, works made in the 1960s and 70s where, rather than trying to make one particular image that makes the body look strange or alarming, artists like Giuseppe Pannoni have made almost exhaustive kind of encyclopedias of the body, so making close-ups of every single part of his own body, one at a time, and then framing them separately and showing them as a kind of map almost of his body. By contrast, Kate Craig she had her partner film her body with a video camera, but left the camera lens extremely close to her skin. So you're moving around over the surface of her body, but essentially never far enough away from it to actually make it into a body. And this split between what you see by being very close to something and the inability to kind of resolve that into an entire image is something that's been exploited very, very, very successfully. This work, Simon Starling's Inventar, is a really phenomenal piece of I guess you could sort of call it filmmaking, but it's filmmaking almost in a 19th century style. What Simon Starling has done is he's taken a sequence of still shots using a camera with an electron microscope, and then put those shots in sequence, much as you would with a flickbook or some early form of animation, so that they overlap, giving the appearance of moving seamlessly, zooming closer and closer in to the subject. Simon Starling's work is remarkable also because the subject of that close-up is itself a photograph. It's a Man Ray photograph of a geological fold, a rock formation. And so we move within the show, if you like, from an artist like Man Ray making a photograph of a rock formation within which he might see a certain kind of form or a certain kind of shape, to Simon Starling 70 or 80 years later, moving inside the surface of the Man Ray photograph. So it's really quite fascinating to see the longevity of the idea of the close-up. They're still interested in taking the human eye further than it can normally go, and if you like, trying to see the invisible through closer and closer attention to the visible.